There are seas that breathe like living things, and there are others, like this one, that only wait. The village of Carvin's Hollow lay at the farthest edge of the coast, where the tide met the cliffs with a sound like slow thunder. No one lived there now, not since the year when the sea swallowed 12 homes in a single night. Yet every dawn, a faint line of smoke could still be seen rising from the last house by the shore, the house that everyone said was gone. It belonged once to Elias Moran, a sailor who vanished nearly 20 years ago. And now, for reasons the sea alone might know, the house seemed to be breathing again. The story begins on a morning when Anya Crow, a marine archaeologist, stepped off a rusted ferry and walked the narrow trail to Carvin's Hollow. She had come looking for something older than myth, the lost wreck of the Iona, a passenger ship that had gone missing in 1889 somewhere along this stretch of coast. But when she reached the cliffs, the wind spoke her name. It wasn't possible, of course. No one here knew her. No one had said her name aloud. Still, the sea said it again, softly, like a memory she'd forgotten. Anya. The sound came between waves. She froze. The tide below rolled backward, dragging the shingle into a hiss of sand and salt, then silence. Her heart beat once, twice, then steadied. She told herself it was the wind through the reeds, but the wind didn't sound like her mother's voice. That evening, Anya reached the edge of the ruins, half-buried chimneys, rusted fences, the skeletons of fishing boats that had become part of the sand. And then she saw it, Elias Moran's house. It shouldn't have been there. Every old record said it was destroyed in the storm of 1902. Yet, standing before her now was a crooked cottage with salt-eaten walls, its windows glinting faintly like eyes in the dusk. The door was ajar. Inside, the air smelled like burnt rope and seaweed. A lantern still hung above the hearth. The furniture was old but dry, untouched by rot or mold. And on the table, as if waiting for supper, was a single plate with a ring of salt around it. That night, she stayed there, telling herself it was for research, though a small part of her felt she had been expected. She set her recorder on the desk and began speaking softly, the sound of her own voice grounding her. Day 1, Carvin's Hollow. The shoreline patterns suggest land subsidence, maybe caused by. She stopped. Outside, something moved along the window. The curtain fluttered, and a pale shape passed beyond the glass, just for a second, like a person walking beneath the tide. When she stepped out to look, there was no one there, only the sea, still as glass, reflecting the moon. At midnight, she awoke to a different sound, a knock, slow and deliberate, coming from beneath the floorboards. 3 knocks, a pause, then one more. She whispered to herself, "It's the pipes, or the shifting beams, old wood." But deep down, she felt the truth press against her chest. The sea had followed her inside. By morning, the tide had come unusually close. The wet sand reached almost to the front steps. The air carried a faint hum, like a tuning fork struck deep beneath the waves. She followed the shoreline for an hour, tracing remnants of an old dock. Halfway down, she saw a boot print in the sand, fresh. It was a man's print, deep, heavy, and there was only one. When she looked closer, she saw that the print faced the sea, not from it. She turned slowly. On the cliff above her, half hidden by fog, stood a figure in an old naval coat, watching her. For a heartbeat, she couldn't move. Then the fog thickened, and the figure was gone. Back in the house, she found something she hadn't noticed the night before, a cracked photograph pinned behind a cupboard. It showed a man in uniform, smiling faintly, standing beside a ship's wheel. The name etched on the frame read Elias Thorne, 1889. Below it, a handwritten note in faded ink: "If the tide does not return, wait. The sea always comes for what it left behind." Anya's pulse slowed. She whispered the words aloud, as if they belonged to a prayer. And for the first time, she heard it, faintly, from somewhere deep beneath the house. A second voice, repeating the same line, but slower, older, cracked by water. The sea always comes for what it left behind. The walls shivered. The lantern flickered once, then went out. And for a long moment, everything was silent except the breathing of the tide below. Slow, steady, patient. The sea was waiting. The second morning came without sunlight. A low, gray mist hung over the coast, swallowing the cliffs and the sea into one colorless breath. Anya woke to the faint rhythm of dripping water, tap, 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 like a clock that had forgotten its time. The air was damp, colder than before. She ran her hand along the wooden wall. It felt wet, as if the sea had crept closer during the night. Outside, the waves had risen higher again. Their foam reached the doorstep, trembling against the old stones. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Tide pattern unstable, possibly lunar surge or fault displacement." But then she crossed it out. It didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate. While exploring the house, she found a small trapdoor beneath the rug in the hallway. It was sealed shut with rusted nails, but through the gaps, she could feel air rising, cold and moist, carrying the faint smell of salt and rope. She fetched her tools and pried it open. Below, a ladder descended into shadow, a crawl space filled with the sound of dripping water. Her torchlight trembled across walls lined with glass jars. Inside each jar floated something pale, seashells, feathers, maybe bone. And at the center, on a table crusted with salt, she saw a journal wrapped in oilskin. The cover read, "E.M. Log 13. The first page was written in thick, hurried strokes. The sea spoke again tonight. It called my name through the walls. I sealed the hatch, but it will not forget me. Each page grew more frantic, the handwriting uneven, sometimes smeared as though written underwater. I hear them walking in the tide. They knock when I sleep. If anyone finds this, do not wake the sea. Anya closed the journal, her fingers trembling. The sound of the waves grew louder, as though responding to her discovery. For a moment, she thought she saw movement reflected on the damp wall, a shape turning its head behind her. But when she spun around, there was only the ladder and the empty dark. That evening, as the mist thickened into rain, she built a small fire. She listened to the crackling wood, trying to anchor herself in its warmth. But beneath that sound, another rhythm began, faint, consistent, impossible to ignore. It was the same knocking from the night before, only now it came from the walls. She pressed her ear against the wood. There were pauses between each knock, almost like a message in code. She started whispering the rhythm out loud. 1, 2, pause, 3, until she realized it wasn't random. It matched the beats of a heartbeat. The rain fell harder. Her lantern flickered, and then silence. When she looked up, there was a shadow standing by the window, a man's outline blurred by water and glass. She froze. Slowly, she raised the lantern. The figure did not move, and then it smiled. Not wide, not human, just a slight tilt, like a memory of a smile caught in a reflection. She backed away. The flame quivered and went out. In that instant of darkness, she heard footsteps, not outside, but inside the room, pacing slowly, circling her. Her hand brushed against the recorder on the table. She hit record. If anyone hears this, the house is the sound cut off. A whisper came through the recorder, not her voice. Wait by the sea. When she came to, it was dawn again. She lay on the floor beside the hearth, her clothes damp. The recorder's still running, but the tape was blank, except for one faint sound, waves recorded from underwater. She went outside. The sea had retreated far, unnaturally far, as if the tide had been pulled by a great unseen breath. Across the exposed seabed, she could see something glinting, metal, tangled ropes, the outline of a sunken ship. It was the Iona, the ship she had come to find. But it wasn't wrecked. It was standing upright, perfectly preserved, as though it had just landed there last night. And between the railings, she thought she saw figures, motionless, white as salt, staring toward her through the fog. When the sea empties itself, it leaves behind its memories. That morning, the horizon looked broken. The water had withdrawn for nearly half a mile, uncovering the bones of forgotten things. Anya walked slowly down the wet sand, each step sinking into the seabed as though the earth were trying to hold her back. The air smelled of rust and old salt. The wind carried no sound, not even the cry of gulls. The Iona stood before her, tilted slightly to one side. Its hull was blackened with time, its name barely visible beneath the film of barnacles. Yet something about it felt wrong. Ships that old don't stay intact. They crumble. They dissolve into reefs. But this one was preserved, almost waiting, like a photograph of a ship instead of a ship itself. She reached the edge of the wreck, her boots half submerged in thin pools of tidewater. The gangway hung loose but solid. When she touched it, the metal was warm. She climbed aboard. The deck was covered in a thin layer of sand, as if the sea had been carrying it lovingly for years. There were no fish bones, no driftwood, no sign of storm damage, only silence, a silence that listened back. She walked toward the bridge, brushing dust off old plaques. One still bore a name, Captain Elias Thorne. Her pulse froze. The same man, the one whose house she'd slept in, the one who vanished with the ship more than a century ago. Inside the cabin, everything was intact. Books neatly arranged, maps folded, lamps upright. But on the table sat something out of place. A teacup, half filled, steam still rising faintly. She touched it. It was hot. Then, from the corridor behind her, a low murmur drifted, voices, muffled, indistinct. She followed the sound. It came from behind a closed door marked Crew Quarters. When she pushed it open, the air shifted, heavy, dense. Rows of bunks lined the room. On each bunk lay the imprint of a body in the sheets, as if someone had just gotten up moments before. The whispering grew louder. She turned toward the far end, where the light flickered. A man stood there in a sailor's coat, facing the wall, motionless. "Hello," she whispered. No answer. She took one step forward. The man turned his head slightly, not to her, but toward the porthole. Outside, the sea had started to return. A slow, crawling tide was pushing in, swallowing the sand, the silence, and the path back to shore. The man whispered something. She couldn't hear it. Then he vanished, like breath fading from glass. She ran back to the deck. The tide had reached the gangway, waves beginning to lap at her boots. The ship was rising, but not with the water. It was lifting, as if remembering what it was made for. Panic clawed at her throat. She tried to jump off, but the sea below no longer looked like water. It looked solid, like a sheet of glass reflecting the clouds. And beneath that glass, she saw faces, pale, open-eyed, moving slowly as if trying to surface. One face she recognized, her own. She stumbled backward, gasping, her vision blurred. The world tilted, the horizon folded into itself. The next moment, she was back in the house, drenched, breathing hard, sand still clinging to her hands. The recorder on the table was playing by itself. Through the static, a man's voice whispered, "Welcome home, Captain." The voice was hers. She heard it again, softer, echoing from inside the walls. "You came back." She stared at the cracked mirror, above the mantel. The reflection staring back wasn't hers. It was Elias Moran, smiling faintly, salt water running from his eyes like tears. That night, she didn't sleep. The waves rose until they reached the windows. The entire house trembled with the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't hers. She wrote one last line in her notebook before the candle went out. The tide doesn't just return, it remembers. And from somewhere beneath the floorboards, something answered, a slow, deliberate knock in the same rhythm she'd heard before. 3 paws. 1. The sound of a sea remembering the shape of its own shore. Time in Carvin's Hollow was no longer moving forward. It was circling, the same hours replaying themselves, disguised as new mornings. Anya woke to sunlight for the first time since arriving. But the light felt off. It carried the amber hue of old photographs. Her hands looked different too, paler, almost translucent when the rays touched her skin. She stepped outside. The tide had retreated again, but the sea was wrong. It didn't stretch to the horizon anymore. Instead, it mirrored the sky perfectly. Clouds floating below her feet, sun shimmering upside down. The waves had turned still, like glass reflecting another world beneath it. And on that mirrored surface, she saw movement, a small rowboat drifting across the reflection of the sky. A man sat in it, rowing slowly, his face hidden beneath a hat. When she blinked, he vanished. Only the echo of the oars remained, soft splashes in a sea that wasn't supposed to move. Back inside, she examined the photograph she'd found earlier, the one of Elias Moran. The ink had changed overnight. Where it once said Elias Moran, 1889, it now read E.M., recorded by a crow, 1902. Her name, her handwriting. She dropped the photograph. It landed face down, but the reflection in the window showed it still looking back at her, smiling. At dusk, she lit the lantern again. Its flame flickered even when there was no wind. In the faint glow, she noticed something carved into the mantel, shallow, almost erased by time. We live in the echo, not the hour. She whispered it aloud, and at that moment, the room changed. The air shifted temperature, colder, denser. The fire stopped crackling. The ticking of the old clock halted mid-second. Through the window, she saw the world outside dissolve. The sea began to shimmer like a sheet of quicksilver. The cliffs, the clouds, even her own reflection, all began to slide downward, like paint melting from a canvas. And then stillness. She stood in the same room, but everything was subtly older. The furniture less decayed, the wallpaper intact, the air filled with the faint scent of tobacco and salt. Footsteps echoed above her, men's voices, the creak of boots. Anya realized she was no longer in her own time. A knock came at the door, calm, deliberate. When she opened it, she saw him, Elias Moran, alive. wearing his naval coat, his eyes clear and deep as the tide. He looked at her without surprise, as if he had been waiting all along. "You came back," he said. "The sea always brings its own home." His voice was calm, warm, almost kind, but behind it lingered something hollow, an echo of centuries. Anya tried to speak, but her throat felt heavy. All she could whisper was, "What is this place?" Elias stepped aside, motioning toward the open door behind him, the same door that once led to the cliffs, but now it opened to a hallway of water, walls rippling like submerged glass. "It's not a place," he said. "It's what the sea remembers." As she walked beside him, the house faded, replaced by corridors that seemed to breathe reflections of rooms she'd already explored, looping infinitely. Sometimes she saw herself ahead, turning corners a second before she did. Sometimes she heard voices, her own, from yesterday, from years ago, whispering through the tide. They reached the end of the corridor, where the floor disappeared into a slow, dark pool. Elias knelt by the edge. "Every captain returns to his tide," he said, "but some of us bring others back with us." Anya felt the water's pull, gentle, persuasive. Her reflection on its surface was no longer her own. It was wearing his coat. Then, as if the sea itself took a breath, the surface broke, revealing the ship Iona beneath, sailing through darkness. The air filled with the deep, sonorous hum of the ocean's memory, that low vibration that lives beneath all silence. The lantern flickered in her hand. Droplets rose upward, defying gravity. And just before everything went black, Elias whispered, "Do not look for the shore. The sea will find you." When she awoke, she was on the ship again. The world outside glowed faintly blue, as though she were sailing beneath the moon. The crew stood motionless along the deck, faces turned toward the horizon. Only Elias moved, pacing slowly, looking at her as though waiting for her to remember something. Anya whispered, "Where am I now?" He smiled faintly. "Where you always were." The ship Iona drifted through a sea without stars. It was not night, but something gentler, a pale, endless blue, like breath frozen in glass. Every sound seemed swallowed before it began. Even her footsteps were silent. Anya walked across the deck. The crew stood facing the horizon, statues in worn coats, their eyes wide open, unblinking. The sails moved, though there was no wind. The water below pulsed faintly, as if the sea itself had a heartbeat. She turned to Elias. He stood at the bow, hat in hand, staring forward, as though trying to read something written across the waves. "What happened to them?" she asked quietly. He didn't turn. "They listened too long," he said. "The sea tells stories, but if you listen to them, you forget your own." She stepped closer. The lantern in her hand flickered softly, its glow reflected in 1,000 ripples. The water was too still, too clear, she could see faces beneath it, pale and moving slowly, like memories trapped in glass. They weren't drowning, they were waiting, and among them she saw her own. For a moment she froze, the reflection of herself below, moving just a second to slow. It raised its hand after she did, smiled when she didn't. Then it whispered, not through air, but directly into her thoughts. We were never on land. The lantern went out. Darkness didn't fall. It rose from beneath the deck, from the corners of the ship, from the folds of the horizon. Anya tried to light the lantern again, but the wick was wet, dripping with salt water that smelled of the deep. Elias's voice came from somewhere ahead. You came to record the sea, he said, but the sea records you. She could see his outline faintly now, dissolving as though made of smoke. His hat drifted upward, then vanished. Only his voice remained. Every memory you left behind on land, your name, your face, your time, they've already reached the shore. But what remains here belongs to the tide. Anya felt her pulse slow. She tried to speak, but words felt heavy, delayed. Sound itself had begun to fade, replaced by a deep, rhythmic vibration beneath her feet. She looked down. The ship was transparent. Through the planks, she saw the ocean floor moving closer. The crew began to hum softly in unison. It wasn't a song, it was something older, a sound between mourning and memory. Their lips didn't move, but the tone filled the air like low thunder. Anya stumbled backward. The hum vibrated in her bones, syncing with her heartbeat until she could no longer tell which was which. And then, amid the hum, she heard herself, her voice, from her first night in Carvin's Hollow. I just need one more story. The sea had remembered that too. The mast groaned. The ship began to tilt. Water climbed the railings, but did not splash. It climbed like smoke, silent and deliberate. It wrapped around her legs, her waist, her shoulders. Each drop shimmered like liquid glass. Elias appeared once more beside her, or what was left of him. His outline flickered like the reflection of a candle in deep water. He reached out his hand. There are no endings, he whispered, only returns. She took his hand. For the first time, it felt warm, and then everything fell away. Sound, color, thought, silence, true, infinite silence. Not empty, but full, as if every voice that ever was still lived within it. Anya opened her eyes. She stood on the shore of Carvin's Hollow again. The cottage was gone. The cliffs were smooth and untouched, as though no one had ever lived there. The tide had receded miles away. She looked down the sea, mirrored the sky again, still, bright, endless. Her reflection stood there, smiling faintly, holding the same lantern. And for the first time, she noticed the inscription carved into the lantern's base, EM 1889 4AC. When the tide remembers. A wave approached, soft, deliberate, like a breath returning home. She stepped forward. The water met her feet, cool and weightless. Somewhere, faintly, she heard the sound of oars, slow, rhythmic, the same sound that had haunted her since the beginning. The reflection spoke once more, barely a whisper. "It's time." And she walked into the sea. It accepted her like memory, returning to its origin. The lantern's light faded beneath the surface, a single golden glow drifting downward. Then stillness. The sea waited once more. The night after the storm felt hollow, as though the sea had drawn a breath and forgotten to exhale. Elias stood by the cracked pier, his lantern swaying in the wind. Every gust dimmed its light, then coaxed it back, as if the flame itself was breathing with the tide. Behind him, the inn was silent. The old caretaker's chair rocked gently, untouched by hands. The village above had gone to sleep early, frightened, perhaps, not of the storm, but of what followed it. When Elias lifted the lantern toward the water, he noticed something new. The sea, calm now, reflected nothing. No stars, no moon, only black glass. Yet beneath that blackness, faintly, shapes moved, not fish, not currents, shapes that walked. He lowered the lantern closer to the surface, and the flame flickered once, twice, then steadied. The reflection that looked back was not his own. He stumbled backward, heart pounding, yet the sea remained still. The reflection held its shape, the same face, but older. Eyes empty, expression waiting. Elias whispered to himself, "You're tired. It's the hour and the wind." But the older face whispered back, in a voice almost swallowed by the tide, "Do you remember the sound of the bells?" The words rippled across the water like ink spreading through paper. Bells. He did remember bells, faint and distant, tolling somewhere below the waves. The reflection smiled. He staggered toward the boathouse. The wood smelled of salt and decay. Nets hung like cobwebs, tangled with shells and dried weeds. He searched for the source of the whisper, but found only silence. Then, at the edge of the boathouse wall, his lantern revealed a carving he hadn't seen before. Deep, uneven letters scratched into the damp wood. They never left. The flame trembled. The lantern hissed. Outside, the tide sighed against the shore, the sound of breathing, of something almost human. He sat for a long time, his back against the damp floorboards, staring at the phrase. Each word began to move in his head, rearranging themselves, spelling things he could no longer tell apart from dreams. He felt the weight of sleep tugging at him, not from tiredness, but from invitation. When he woke, he wasn't sure he had slept. The lantern burned low, the air was cold, and from the pier came a slow creaking sound, as though someone was walking toward him. The figure appeared through the mist, faint, watery, almost shimmering. A woman in an old dress, her hair flowing as though underwater. She stopped just beyond the reach of the lantern's glow. "Why do you come here?" her voice asked, soft, melodic, trembling like a memory. Elias tried to speak, but the words came out dry. "This place, was it yours?" The woman's eyes lowered. "It is. It always will be." And before the lantern could flicker again, she turned and walked into the sea, her body dissolving into ripples of faint light, sinking without a sound. Elias ran forward, but the tide remained unbroken, serene, almost sacred. Only the faint bell sounded again from beneath. He stood there, whispering into the darkness, "What do you want from me?" And somewhere deep within the waves, a voice answered, not hers, not his, but something older, to remember. He sank to his knees, lantern still in hand. The flame was dying, the sea was listening, and the air was full of whispers, not one, but many, speaking at once. They didn't plead, they recounted births, names, songs, conversations long dissolved by time. The drowned didn't weep, they remembered endlessly. The sea, Elias realized, was not haunted by ghosts. It was the ghost. And as dawn finally broke, the lantern went out. And for the first time since his arrival, the tide receded, revealing the faint outline of a road beneath the sea, the road that led to the village that waited. At dawn, the mist lifted like an exhausted curtain. The sea, once a wall of black water, had drawn itself back, not far, not completely, just enough to reveal a trembling, glistening path beneath the waves. Elias stepped forward, each foot sinking into cold sand. His reflection no longer followed him. Before him stretched a road made of cobblestones, slick with salt, leading out toward the horizon where the sea once reigned, and under the surface shimmered outlines of houses, an entire village sleeping beneath the tide. The lantern was dead, yet somehow he still carried its faint circle of warmth. The morning light was too pale to comfort, too thin to trust. He whispered to himself, "It's only low tide," though he already knew this was no ordinary tide. It was a memory of receding. As he walked, the air began to thicken. His breath fogged before his eyes, though the sun had risen. The silence was immense. Even the gulls had forgotten how to cry. Below his feet, he could hear faint vibrations, like heartbeats trapped in the stones. He stopped beside what looked like a well, half submerged. Around its rim were faint symbols, eroded but still visible, spirals, waves, and eyes, always eyes. When he leaned close, the sound returned. Voices, not screams, not pleas, just quiet conversations, looping endlessly. Words of families, of markets, of bells. The hum of a day that had ended long ago, still playing beneath the earth like a song trapped in a shell. He whispered, "The sea remembers everything." He followed the road farther. Every few steps, he found fragments, a shoe, a porcelain cup, a rusted key, a nameplate half buried in sand that read, "Anya's house." He froze. The woman from last night, the one who had asked him why he came. He knelt down and brushed the sand away. The keyhole beneath the nameplate gleamed faintly, as if waiting. A strange certainty guided him. He pressed his hand into the wet earth and the seaside. The waterline behind him began to shift forward, closing in like a slow inhale. There wasn't much time. He pushed open the door. Inside, the air was dry. It shouldn't have been possible. Sunlight drifted through the windows, as though the house had been waiting for dawn. There were teacups on the table, the scent of lavender, and a mirror on the wall, slightly tilted, reflecting not the room, but the shore above. Elias stared into it. The inn, the pier, the cliffs, all visible, shimmering faintly. But standing on the pier was another Elias. He was still holding the lantern, still waiting for the tide to return. The real Elias, or whoever he had become, reached toward the glass. The reflection looked back, and the mirror's surface rippled like water. "Which one of us stayed behind?" he whispered. A child's laughter echoed from the upper floor. He turned sharply. The stairs creaked with each step, the sound muffled as though through water. At the top, he found a room filled with drawings, paper pinned to walls, drawn in charcoal and salt. They all showed the same thing: a house, a sea, and a figure holding a lantern, but drawn without a face. The last page fluttered in the breeze from the window, carrying a faint scent of seaweed. On it, scrawled in faded ink, "When the tide leaves, the living return to look for us, but they never remember which side they're on." Outside, the waves began to advance again, slow, deliberate, unrelenting. Elias ran down the stairs, lantern still clutched, though its light had long gone. The house trembled. The road began to vanish behind a veil of blue. He stepped out just as the water rose to his knees, his waist, his chest carrying him backward, away from the door, away from the keyhole that was already sinking beneath the tide. And just before the last glimpse of the roof disappeared beneath the returning sea, he saw her, Anya, standing at the window, her face calm, her hand raised, not waving, welcoming. The tide reclaimed the village, and when it did, the waves whispered the same word they had always whispered, in a voice almost kind: "Stay." The sea swallowed him quietly. There was no violence in the act, only inevitability, like a page turning itself. Elias drifted in the water, eyes half open, lungs straining against the weight. The world above became a blurred ribbon of silver. The world below, a slow descent into blue silence. He did not panic. Panic had left him days ago. The deeper he sank, the clearer everything became. The light, the music, and most of all, the bells. They told not in warning, but in rhythm. Each note came with a pulse of memory. Markets, footsteps, laughter, a woman calling her child's name from a window. And through that symphony of the drowned, Elias began to see them. The village beneath the sea was alive. It wasn't ruin he saw, not bones and wreckage, but motion. Figures moved through the streets as if the day had never ended. They lit lanterns that burned underwater. They walked with the weightless patience of dreams. Every window glowed faintly from within. He drifted toward the church tower, where the bells sang from their cradle of coral. And as he approached, the shapes of people turned, not to him, but through him. Their eyes were mirrors. Their mouths moved in conversation he couldn't hear. The tide carried him through the church doors. Inside, candles flickered in impossible stillness. At the altar stood a woman. She smiled gently. "You followed the road," she said, her voice echoing as if spoken across centuries. Elias nodded, unsure if he still had breath or words. "Then you remember," she continued. "The sea doesn't take, it keeps." He looked around. The congregation stared back. Men, women, children, all perfectly still, eyes shimmering with faint light. "Are they dead?" he asked. Anya tilted her head. "You think of death as leaving. We never left. We are the tide's memory." She stepped closer, her movements slow, dreamlike. When the storm came, the bells rang for too long. We thought it was salvation, but the sea was listening. It remembered the sound. He wanted to ask her what it remembered, but she was already turning away. Her reflection in the water beside her walked in the opposite direction. The bells began to toll faster now. The congregation's faces blurred. The church's walls folded inward, dissolving into ripples. Elias felt the current pulling him, not down, but backward through memory. He saw flashes of himself as a boy running through these same streets, chasing waves with a stick. His mother's voice, his father's hand, and Yez's laughter from the pier. He tried to hold on to them, but every image disintegrated the moment he touched it. The sea was not showing him the past, it was reclaiming it. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing on the shore. Night had returned. The lantern beside him flickered with weak light. He stumbled toward the inn, drenched and shivering. But when he entered, the air was warm, the candles were lit, and the caretaker was alive. The old man looked up from his chair. "You were gone a long while," he said calmly. Elias froze. You saw me leave." "Of course," the caretaker smiled. "We all leave. We all come back." He turned the page of his book, the same one that had been blank before. Now it was filled with names, and at the very bottom of the list, freshly written, was Elias Thorne. Outside, the bells tolled once more, slow, deliberate, eternal. The caretaker looked toward the door and whispered, "They ring every time someone remembers." And from the distant waves came the reply, faint, sorrowful, and endless. "The sea waits for everyone." The next morning arrived without color. The sea had retreated again, but the world it left behind no longer belonged to him. Elias stood outside the inn, watching the horizon bend and shimmer as though he were staring through glass. The cliffs that once guarded the shore were gone. The roads, the trees, all faint impressions, like charcoal sketches, half erased by time. Only the sound of the bells persisted, faint but constant, blending with the heartbeat of the tide. He walked toward the pier, though it no longer led anywhere. It ended abruptly in fog. The caretaker's voice followed him from the distance, a faint hum, an old tune that sounded like a lullaby. Elias turned back. The inn was there, yet not there. Its walls shifted like reflections in water. He whispered, "Am I still dreaming?" The air did not answer, but the sea did. From beneath the fog came ripples, slow, measured, deliberate. At first, he thought it was the tide returning, but the sound was too rhythmic, too human. Footsteps, shapes emerged from the haze, dozens of them, figures walking across the water as if on invisible ground. Their clothes hung heavy and dark, their faces blurred by mist, and every one of them carried something: glowing lanterns, candles, orbits of soft light swaying with each step. Elias called out, "Who are you?" One of them stopped. A woman's voice floated back, gentle as rain. "We are the memories of those who waited." The rest continued forward, passing through him, leaving trails of cold across his skin. The fog thickened. Elias began to feel the weight of the sea in his chest, not drowning, not fear, but a pull, as though something below was calling him home. He tried to turn away, but the road to the village was gone. The land itself was dissolving, the stones of the pier slipping quietly into the waves. He ran toward the inn, but its door swung open before he reached it. Inside, the caretaker stood by the window, staring into nothing. "They're walking again," he said softly. "It happens every generation. The sea opens for the ones who remember too much." Elias's breath trembled. "Remember what?" The old man turned, his eyes pale and calm. "Their deaths." The bells tolled again, louder now, clearer, as if the tower beneath the waves was rising closer to the surface. With each chime, Elias saw fragments of light burst across the fog faces, laughter, candlelit tables, moments of life that belonged to other people. He saw himself among them, smiling, alive, long ago, the night before the flood, the moment the bells had rung too long, the moment the sea had decided to remember them all forever. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as if to hold the present together, but the memories spilled through his fingers like sand. Outside, the sea began to rise again, slowly at first, then with growing determination. The water reached the pier, then the door, then the caretaker's feet. Elias shouted, "We have to leave." The caretaker smiled gently. "You never did, son." And as the waves filled the room, his body dissolved into salt and dust. His final breath escaping like a sigh of relief. Elias stumbled out into the open, the sea now waist-high. The fog had turned silver in the dim morning light, glowing faintly with thousands of reflections, all of them his own, staring back from the surface. Each reflection whispered the same words in perfect unison: "You've come home." He fell backward into the water, letting it claim him once more. The cold was not unkind. It felt almost familiar. As his body sank, the bells tolled one last time, steady and patient, a funeral song not of mourning but of return. The sea had come back for its memory, and Elias Thorne, like all who walked that shore before him, finally remembered what he had always been, a story the sea could not forget. The sea was no longer loud. It whispered instead, not as waves, but as ticks, soft and measured, the rhythm of an unseen mechanism beneath the water. Elias drifted through that whisper, neither floating nor sinking, weightless between two worlds. Around him, fragments of the village flickered, the church steeple, the market road, the cliffs. Each shimmered like a half-remembered photograph, dissolving as soon as he tried to focus. Somewhere below, the bells chimed again, but this time he heard something beneath the chime, the steady, dry pulse of gears turning underwater. It wasn't just a tower ringing the bells, it was a clock, and it was still working. When Elias opened his eyes, he was standing, though he could not recall climbing out of the sea. He stood inside a vast, circular room built entirely of glass and rusted metal. The walls were lined with old timepieces, pendulums, pocket watches, church clocks, all motionless, all pointing to different hours. At the center of the chamber stood a man bent over a brass console. He wore a long coat soaked with salt water, his silver hair clinging to his face, and behind him hundreds of gears turned slowly, their teeth gnashing through the remnants of coral and bone. Elias whispered, "Who are you?" The man didn't turn round. He adjusted a dial, and the bells rang faintly overhead. "I am the one who remembers the seconds," he said. His voice was neither young nor old. It carried the echo of eternity. Elias stepped closer. "You built this. I keep it," the man replied. "The sea forgets everything eventually, but time needs a keeper." The chamber trembled, and through the glass walls, Elias saw shadows drifting, the same figures he'd seen walking across the tide. They moved like ghosts through the water, carrying faint lights, their motions synchronized to the rhythm of the gears. The man continued, "Every century, the sea reclaims the shore. It remembers its dead. It drags them here." He turned now, revealing eyes like polished obsidian, reflecting the clock faces behind Elias. But one must stay awake to wind the world again. Elias felt the pull of truth pressing against his chest. It wasn't the sea that remembered, it was this machine, and the man was its heartbeat. Elias asked quietly. "How long have you been here?" The man smiled. "Long enough for my name to rust away." He pointed toward the largest clock on the far wall, its hands frozen at midnight. "Once I was the clockmaker of your village, the one who warned the people not to build near the sea. They laughed. They said the tide couldn't reach that high." Elias felt the chill crawl up his spine. "I remember. My father said there was a storm. The bells rang for hours." "Yes," the man nodded, "because I kept them ringing to warn you. But when the waves took the town, I stayed. The clock must never stop, because if it does—" He leaned closer, his voice a whisper. "Time will stop remembering the living." The gears groaned, ancient, metallic lungs gasping under pressure. Through the walls, Elias saw the fog outside begin to swirl, revealing glimpses of the world above. Moments replayed like broken film reels, the village burning lanterns, children running down the pier, the flood rushing in. And then he saw himself standing on the cliffs that night, watching the tide swallow the streets below, not as a survivor, but as the last one to wind the clock. Elias staggered back, breathless. "No, I'm not." "You are," the man interrupted gently. "You took my place. You came here long ago, before your name faded. You wound the mechanism so the world could begin again. And when your memory dissolved, the sea sent you back to find your purpose once more." Elias fell to his knees, the ticking growing deafening. The man placed a rusted key into his hand, the same key Elias had seen in his dreams. "It's your turn again," he said. "Wind the world, or let it drown in silence." The bells began to slow. The sea outside trembled, rising higher, pressing against the glass walls like a living creature desperate to return. Elias looked at the key, corroded, heavy, yet pulsing faintly with warmth. He turned to the man. "And you?" The clockmaker smiled, his form already fading. "My time ran out a century ago. I only stayed long enough to see if you'd remember." Then he vanished, scattered into mist, leaving only the echo of gears and a faint scent of salt. Elias stepped toward the console. The key fit perfectly into the central dial. When he turned it, the machine shuddered, a low moan reverberating through the deep. The clocks on the walls began to move again, one by one, their hands aligning toward a single hour. Outside, the sea began to reverse, its tides unwinding like a reel played backward. The drowned figures paused mid-step, then turned their faces toward him, whispering as one. "Let the world remember." The bells tolled once more, not as a warning, but as a heartbeat restarting. The fog lifted, the horizon returned. When Elias opened his eyes again, he stood on the beach, sunlight spilling across the wet sand. The village was gone, but the sea was calm. In his palm, the rusted key gleamed faintly, ticking like a watch. He walked away from the shore, every step echoing like the start of time itself. And far beneath the waves, unseen by any living soul, the clock of the drowned continued to turn. The sunlight felt too heavy. Every step Elias took on the sand left behind not a footprint, but a faint shimmer, as though the ground itself was remembering his walk. The village was gone, swallowed decades ago. Yet now the land carried a faint afterimage of it. Lampposts without shadows, echoes of laughter in the mist, and the smell of freshly baked bread drifting from an invisible street. He was not walking through the world. He was walking through its memory. By the time the sun reached its highest point, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the old cliff road where his father's house once stood. To his eyes, the land looked barren, but when he blinked, the air trembled and the house flickered into being, its walls intact, windows gleaming, smoke curling from the chimney. The door creaked open on its own, as though expecting him. Inside, everything waited precisely where it had always been, the dining table set for 4, the curtains swaying gently, and the clock on the mantelpiece ticking perfectly in rhythm with his pulse. "Elias," a voice called softly. He froze. It was his mother's voice, clear, patient, like when she used to call him to supper. He turned, and there she stood, or what the memory of her had become. She looked the same, but there was something hollow in her eyes, as if they reflected not light, but recorded time. "My boy," she said, smiling faintly, "you came home." Elias could barely speak. "You're alive." She tilted her head. "We never left, Elias. We were only paused. You wound the world again, didn't you?" He felt his chest tighten. Her tone was tender, too tender for the horror of what he was seeing. "Where's father?" he asked. She pointed to the far side of the room. There, sitting by the piano, was a figure half shadow, half form. His father, frozen mid-motion, his hand resting on a key that hummed faintly each time the clock ticked. "He's remembering the song," his mother said softly. "He's been remembering it for 100 years. Elias stepped closer, but the air around his father rippled like disturbed water. Each step he took was accompanied by tiny metallic sounds, like springs tightening inside his skull. The clock on the mantelpiece now ticked louder. It wasn't just marking seconds, it was marking him. He turned to his mother. "The clock, it's different, it's watching." Her smile faltered. "It always was. You just never listened to the sound it made when it looked at you." Elias moved toward it, the pendulum gleaming faintly, as though reflecting his face in 1,000 fragments. Behind the glass, faint impressions pulsed, silhouettes of all the villagers he had seen underwater, drifting through its gears like trapped memories. The more he stared, the more the rhythm synchronized with his heartbeat, until he couldn't tell if it was the clock that ticked or his heart that followed it. Then came the whisper. You wound the world, it said. Now the world wins you. Elias stumbled back, clutching his chest. The air trembled, and the house around him began to change. The walls started peeling like film burned in a projector. The plates on the table faded. The light bent and curved, turning the familiar home into an hourglass of memory. His mother stood motionless, her form fracturing into layers of translucent copies, each one from a different year, a different second. He saw her aging and unaging in flickers, from youth to frailty to nothing, then back again. She smiled faintly, even as her body shimmered apart. Don't be afraid, Elias. The house remembers love too. And then she vanished, not into the air, but into the sound of the clock. Elias dropped to his knees. The ticking was deafening now. It filled the house, the cliffs, the entire horizon. Each beat came from everywhere and nowhere. He felt the rusted key still in his pocket, still warm from when he turned it in the drowned chamber. But when he pulled it out, it wasn't rusted anymore. It gleamed with living gold, its teeth turning faintly on their own, as if remembering the motion of his hand. He realized then the key didn't just wind time. It recorded the one who wound it. He stumbled outside. The sunlight fractured like glass. The village below the cliffs had reappeared again, half real, half reflection. Children ran through empty streets, their laughter echoing like hollow music boxes. And then, among them, Elias saw himself, the boy he once was, running barefoot down the same road. Each version of him appeared again and again. A man, a soldier, an old wanderer, each one walking the same path toward the sea. The present Elias watched in horror. They weren't ghosts. They were echoes of himself, preserved by the machine he had turned back on. The sky dimmed. The tide began to rise again, but slower, thicker, almost deliberate. It carried reflections within it, like a mirror being held up to time. From the horizon came a sound, deep and rolling, the bell tower tolling once more, though no tower stood, and the voice of the drowned clockmaker whispered through the waves, "Time doesn't forget, Elias. It only waits until it remembers you." Elias fell to his knees at the cliff's edge. He stared at the golden key in his trembling hand. Every turn he had made had brought something back, but each time it took something from him in return. He looked out over the shimmering sea, where hundreds of reflections of himself now stood, staring back from the surface. Some older, some younger, some broken, and every one of them mouthed the same words in silence. "You are the memory now." The wind stilled. The last sound he heard before the world dimmed into silver was the click of a lock turning itself. The key dissolved. The clock stopped ticking. And in the stillness that followed, the sea whispered, not in waves, but in words, "The world is wounded. The man is remembered. The morning came again, and then again and again. Elias didn't sleep because there was no longer a night. Each dawn folded into itself like a reflection rewatching its own light. The sun would rise, stop halfway, hesitate, and then begin again, as if uncertain what it meant to move. The air no longer smelled of salt, but of dust that remembered it once had. He stood at the edge of the same cliff where he had seen himself dissolve the day before. The same wind brushed his face. The same seagulls flew across the same patch of sky, except when they blinked, they became still. It wasn't that they froze. It was that the world forgot what flight looked like for a few seconds. Elias whispered into the wind, "Is this the end of time?" The sea below answered softly, a whisper that resembled a voice he knew. There is no end, only the part where the story remembers it stopped. The voice belonged to no one. It drifted like a lullaby, a tone without origin, moving from horizon to horizon. He knelt and touched the ground. The sand shifted, warm, familiar, and beneath it lay thin threads of gold, the same as those on the key that had dissolved in his hand. They ran across the beach, the cliffs, the sea, a faint web of memory, pulsing like veins of light. Each pulse carried an image, a man laughing, a village glowing, a house breathing, a clock turning. Every image was the same, repeating endlessly, as though the world itself had only one thought left. He began to walk. Each step felt like entering a painting already half dry. The air shimmered behind him, his own footsteps trying to fade, but failing. And then he saw the figure ahead, a man standing in the shallows of the tide, staring into the horizon. His coat was torn, his hands trembling, but his posture familiar. Elias approached, heart tightening. "Who are you?" he asked. The man turned, and Elias felt his stomach twist. It was him, not the younger one, not the older one, but a version that looked tired of existing, eyes dulled by infinite dawns. The double spoke softly, as though reciting a memory. "You've asked that question before." Elias stepped closer. "What is this place? What have we done?" The other Elias smiled weakly. "We tried to fix time, but time doesn't need fixing. It just needed someone to remember it. And now you remember. That's all it ever wanted." He held up his hand. In it, a faint glimmer of gold, the same key, but smaller, worn smooth by 1,000 repetitions. "It gives us the same choice each time," the double said. "We turn it or we don't. Either way, it winds us back here." Elias's hands shook, and if I refuse, the double's eyes softened. "Then the sea forgets you." But forgetting isn't freedom. It's another way of remembering. The waves began to rise, not as water, but as shapes of people. Translucent silhouettes, hundreds of them, all walking from the tide. Men, women, children, each one a memory caught mid-breath, all of them with the same faint glimmer in their chests, a ticking light. One by one, they turned to face Elias. He saw the clockmaker, the drowned sailors, the boy who ran through the empty streets, his mother smiling with that same hollow warmth. Every one of them murmured the same thing over and over. "Don't let us stop remembering." Elias's voice broke. "But remembering keeps us trapped." The air shuddered as if his words had weight. The sun flickered once, twice, unsure whether to stay or fade. His mother's voice came gently through the crowd. "No, my boy. Remembering is what keeps us real." The figures began dissolving, turning into mist that swirled back into the sky. The horizon pulsed, stretching infinitely far, as though inviting him to step forward. And then the other Elias spoke once more. "Every time you walk into it, the world begins again. The same story, a little softer, a little slower, until it forgets how to start." He pressed the small golden key into Elias's palm. "Wind it one last time or let it rest. Either way, the sea will wait." Elias stood alone again. The mist thinned. The light on the water became so bright it erased everything but silence. He felt the key pulse in his hand, one heartbeat, then another. He turned it just slightly. The sound it made wasn't a tick, it was a breath. The horizon rippled, the world sighed, and the sea began to move again, calm, endless, eternal. As the tide reached his feet, Elias whispered into the shining mist, "Then let it remember gently." And the sea answered, "It always does." There was no more sound, no more sea, no more horizon, just light, pale, endless, pulsing softly, as if the world itself was breathing in sleep. Elias floated within it, weightless. He could not tell if he was above or below, alive or remembered. The gold key, once sharp and bright, had melted into his skin, leaving a faint shimmer in the center of his palm, a memory that no longer needed to be held. He tried to speak, but there was nothing to speak to, only presence, warm, patient, infinite. At first, he thought it was silence. Then he realized it was a heartbeat, the same rhythm he'd heard beneath the waves, beneath the clocks, beneath every whisper of the tide. Not his own, not human. It was the world's, the pulse of the sea, the sound that came before time began, before stories learned how to tell themselves. And in that heartbeat, Elias felt everything: the house, the clockmaker, the boy by the shore, his mother's quiet voice, the sound of rain against forgotten glass. Each one a note in the same endless lullaby. He opened his eyes, or perhaps the world opened them for him. He stood once more upon the shore. The waves were gentle now, their edges gold in the morning light. The village stood behind him, whole, silent, waiting. A single bell hung in the tower above, unmoving, gleaming faintly like something newly born. Elias looked down. The sand at his feet was warm, unbroken, as if no footprints had ever existed. He took a step forward, and the tide mirrored him, a perfect reflection. He realized then he was not in the world. He was remembered by it. A whisper drifted through the air, 1,000 voices speaking as one. You've done well. The sea sleeps now. It dreams of what you once were. He smiled faintly, the expression slow, almost fragile. Then I can rest too. The voices softened. You already are. The light on the water dimmed, folding itself back into the horizon. A calm wind swept across the sand, carrying with it the faint smell of rain, that ancient, familiar scent that lives in every beginning. Elias sat at the edge of the water. He looked up where the sky met the sea, and for the first time there was no difference between the two, just an unbroken canvas of soft silver and quiet breath. He whispered to no one, what was the story called? And somewhere, deep within the tide, a voice, old as the world and as gentle as its last wave, answered. It was called the sea that waited. The tide moved once more, washing over his feet. When it receded, he was gone, leaving behind only a faint imprint in the sand. For a moment, the sea hesitated, as if listening to itself. Then it exhaled a long, slow breath and began to dream again.